abyss beckons with a chilling call. Come closer, listen to the shadows draw. So subscribe and like, and don't be afraid to dive into the darkness where the shadows are laid. Tales from the shadows will spook your world. Join us on this journey, let your fears unfurl. Stay tuned, stay weird, and watch out for what lurks in the shadows.
Welcome, friends, to the dark and the deep, where whispers linger and shadows creep. Tales from the shadows, where legends arise, with ghostly stories and myths that mesmerize. We continue our tale, picking up right where we left off. Denny's breath came in sharp, shallow puffs as the tunnel finally widened into a cavernous hall. The ice around them shimmered like diamond filigree, casting ethereal blue light that refracted across the floor in shifting patterns. It was beautiful, a masterpiece sculpted by the gods, or perhaps by something far more ancient. Eric stopped beside him, clutching the hilt of his sword with white-knuckled fingers. His eyes swept over the intricate carvings adorned the ice walls, scenes of long-lost battles, frost giants locked in combat with gods, and shapes hinting at figures more mysterious than even the Aesir. "This is it," he whispered, awe and trepidation mixing. Celine limped up behind them, her eyes narrowed with determination. The energy in the room buzzed around them, a silent hum that made their hair stand on end. "We need to be ready for whatever comes next," she said, wincing as she shifted her weight. The pain from the last battle still shadowed her movements, but she pressed forward, unwavering. Denny stepped into the center of the room, Gungnir held tightly in his grasp. The spear's runes glowed faintly, responding to the energy in the chamber. The air felt thick, filled with invisible tendrils tugging at his mind and spirit. He glanced at the far end of the hall, where an arched doorway stood, framed by the sharp etchings of frost runes. Above it, a symbol glowed with a light so cold it almost seemed to absorb the warmth from their bodies. The emblem of Loki. "Is this the way to him?" Eric asked, his voice low and respectful, as if speaking too loudly would wake something slumbering beneath the ice. "It has to be," Denny replied, though a twist of doubt gnawed at his stomach. The closer they got, the more he sensed that their trials were only beginning. Loki was not one to leave things unguarded or straightforward. As if summoned by his thoughts, the ice under their feet began to crackle. A shiver ran down Denny's spine as fissures branched out, glowing blue and spreading like veins. The room seemed to shudder, and suddenly an icy column erupted from the floor. It shot upward, breaking apart and forming into a figure, a creature made of solid ice, humanoid but monstrous, with spiked limbs and eyes, blazed with an unnatural, glacial light. "A frost warden," Eric muttered, dread tightening his features. "We've got company." The warden's gaze swept over them, its eyes cold and calculating, before it raised an arm and slammed it into the ground. The impact sent a shockwave through the chamber, throwing Denny and his friends off their feet. Ice splintered around them, razor-sharp shards spraying like shrapnel. "Get up!" Celine shouted, her hands already crackling with energy. She sent a beam of shimmering light at the warden's chest, but it merely glanced off the creature, leaving only a shallow crack. It roared, a sound like an avalanche bearing down, and charged. Denny rolled to his feet, the tip of Gungnir glowing fiercely. "Eric, Lee, distract it. I'm going for the runes." He dashed to the side, weaving between the smaller outcroppings of ice as Eric and Celine engaged the creature. Eric lunged, his sword slicing through the frigid air and catching the warden's arm. The creature recoiled, shards breaking off but reforming almost instantly. It retaliated, swinging a spiked fist that Eric barely dodged. Celine gritted her teeth and poured more energy into her attack, sweat beading her brow despite the numbing cold. The beam connected with one of the warden's legs, freezing it momentarily in place. Denny reached the far side of the chamber, eyes darting to the runes carved above the archway. They glimmered with Loki's magic, pulsing sequentially as if taunting him to decipher their meaning. He raised Gungnir, the spear vibrating with power, and pointed it toward the center rune. A flash of memory came unbidden, Odin's voice, calm and deep, instructing him on the significance of runic energy. "Bind and break," Denny whispered, tracing the symbol with the spear. The rune flared, and a surge of energy raced down the length of Gungnir. The cavern's temperature plummeted, and a sharp, high-pitched sound filled the air as the warden's movements became sluggish. "It's working!" Eric shouted, catching Denny's eye just before the creature's limbs locked and shattered with a final, mournful crack. Silence descended once more, and the frost-laden air seemed to breathe a sigh. The broken pieces of the warden lay scattered like forgotten pieces of an ancient puzzle. Denny approached the archway, heart thundering as the runes flickered and dimmed, signaling that the seal had been broken. Beyond the arch lay darkness, deep and endless, hiding whatever awaited them in Loki's stronghold. Selene stepped beside him, her hand brushing his shoulder. "Whatever's in there, we face it together." Denny looked at them both, bruised, weary, but unyielding. "Together," he agreed, and with a final breath, they crossed the threshold into the unknown. The passage beyond the arch was narrow, carved from ancient ice that gleamed with a faint, otherworldly light. Each step Denny, Eric, and Selene took sent a whisper echoing down the corridor, as if the walls themselves were listening. The temperature was colder here, biting through their layers and nipping at their exposed skin. Denny felt Gungnir pulse in his grip, the spear's runes glowing more vibrantly than ever before. It was as if the weapon recognized the proximity of something powerful, something connected to the one who had forged it. His pulse quickened, matching the thrumming energy that coursed through the spear. As they pushed further, the corridor opened into a grand hall that took their breath away. The vast chamber had towering columns of translucent ice, twisted into jagged points overhead. Along the floor, runes glowed softly, forming a complex web of enchantments that radiated a soft, eerie light. At the center of the room, an ornate throne carved from glacial stone sat empty, its high back rising like a dagger blade. "Where is he?" Eric murmured, eyes scanning the room for any sign of Loki. The shadows stirred at the edges of the hall, coalescing and shifting as if alive. A low chuckle reverberated through the space, carrying a cold seeping into their bones. "So, you finally made it," came a voice that dripped with amusement and malice. Loki emerged from the darkness, his emerald eyes gleaming as they met Denny's. He looked different from the tales, taller, leaner, and cloaked in a garb shimmering with dark runes. The trickster god seemed almost intangible, like the room's fabric bent around him. Denny tightened his grip on Gungnir, drawing strength from the weapon's ancient power. "This ends here, Loki. Whatever you're planning, we're here to stop it." Loki's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, my half-brother Denny is always eager to play the hero. But this is no tale spun by bards. This is real, and heroes don't always win." He stepped closer, his gaze flickering between Selene and Eric before returning to Denny. "I see you brought friends. How quaint." Selene stepped forward, defiance in her eyes. "We're more than ready for your tricks." "Ah, yes, the mortal mage and the ever-loyal warrior," Loki said, his voice honeyed and mocking. "You must be exhausted after braving my labyrinth. Allow me to offer you rest." He raised a hand, and the runes on the floor flared to life. The temperature in the room plummeted, and an invisible force pulled at them, dragging them down to their knees. Denny struggled against it, the air around him pressing like iron bands. He could feel Gungnir vibrating wildly, resisting the enchantment. "Fight it!" Eric shouted, his voice strained as he pushed himself up with the edge of his sword. Selene's hands glowed with a flicker of her power, but the force was crushing, sapping their strength with each heartbeat. Denny's vision blurred as the edges of the room darkened. Loki loomed over him, a silhouette carved from shadow and ice. "Do you feel that?" Loki whispered, leaning down so only Denny could hear. "That is the weight of inevitability. You should have stayed in Midgard, where you belong." But then, deep within, something stirred. A memory, a feeling, a presence that wasn't his own. It was warm, crackling like a fire, pushing back against the cold. Odin's voice, distant and firm, echoed in his mind. "You carry more than my blood, Denny. You carry my will." With a growl, Denny forced his body to move, raising Gungnir against the force that held him. The spear lit up, sending a wave of energy that cracked the enchantments on the floor. The pressure lifted, and the runes dimmed, splintered by Gungnir's power. Loki's eyes flashed with surprise, and for the first time his smile faltered. Eric surged to his feet, his sword ready. "Now, Denny." Denny didn't hesitate. He lunged at Loki, and the tip of Gungnir aimed true. But the trickster was already moving, dissolving into shadow and reappearing behind them, eyes blazing with anger. "So, you want to play?" Loki's voice thundered. The walls trembled as icy spears shot from the columns, aiming for them. The battle had truly begun. The hall erupted into chaos as Loki's icy spears hurtled through the air. Denny, Eric, and Celine split apart in a practiced maneuver, dodging the jagged projectiles that shattered against the glistening floor. Each impact sent a spray of ice shards spiraling around the room, their sharp edges biting into exposed skin. The chill gnawed at Denny's bones, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the trickster god now stalking them with predatory intent. Celine conjured a shield of glowing energy just in time to deflect a spear aimed at her chest. She stumbled back, sweat beading on her forehead despite the freezing air. "Keep him distracted," she called, her voice tight as she summoned more power, weaving symbols in the air that shimmered with each movement. Eric let out a roar and charged Loki, his sword gleaming with a silver-blue light that hummed with ancestral power. He swung with calculated precision, the blade slicing through the space where Loki had been only a moment before. But the trickster flickered away, his body dissolving into a mass of shadow that reformed on a pillar across the hall. "Is that all?" Loki taunted, arms spread in a mock embrace. His eyes glowed with unnatural light, and he had a cruel smirk. Denny felt a surge of frustration and determination. He tightened his grip on Gungnir, the weapon responding with a flare of light that pulsed through his veins. With a burst of energy, he dashed toward Loki, spear poised to strike. "No tricks this time, Loki." The god's smirk shifted into a snarl, and he raised his hands, summoning a wave of frost that roared toward Denny like an avalanche. Time seemed to slow as Denny leaped, driving Gungnir into the ground. A shockwave of golden energy erupted, shattering the frost wave and sending shards scattering like dust. The blast forced Loki back, his eyes narrowing in fury. "You're stronger than I thought," Loki muttered, wiping a streak of blood from the corner of his mouth. The acknowledgement only fueled Denny's resolve and made him wary. Loki was never sincere without an ulterior motive. Eric took advantage of Loki's momentary distraction, hurling his sword with all the strength he could muster. The blade spun through the air, glinting as it aimed straight for Loki's chest. But Loki's reflexes were sharp. He deflected the blade with a flick, sending it clattering across the icy floor. "Enough!" Loki roared. The hall's columns groaned as if in pain, and the runes on the floor burst into brilliant blue light. The room shuddered, and cracks raced along the walls. Denny's heart pounded as the chamber seemed to fold in on itself, the ice warping to form grotesque figures, monstrous shapes that writhed and took form with glowing eyes and jagged limbs. The ice creatures lumbered forward, closing in on the trio. Celine's eyes widened, and she shot a panicked glance at Denny. "We need to hold them off." "Eric, to me!" Denny called, moving to Celine's side. The three stood back to back as the creatures advanced, their breath visible in the freezing air. The closest beast lunged, and Eric met it head-on, swinging his retrieved sword in a wide arc that cleaved through its torso. The creature shattered into a million shards, but two more took place. Celine raised her hands, summoning a torrent of fire that seared through the air and collided with the advancing line of beasts. The ice hissed and cracked, melting into puddles that quickly refroze into jagged, crystalline patterns. Denny's gaze darted to Loki, who stood at the edge of the hall, eyes narrowed as he orchestrated the chaos. "If we're going to end this, it has to be now," he said, his voice cutting through the din of battle. He lifted Gungnir, feeling the spear's ancient power surge through him. "Loki," he shouted, drawing the god's attention again. Their eyes locked, and for a brief moment, the noise and movement of the battle fell away, leaving only the two of them in a silent confrontation. Loki's smile returned, cold and knowing. "Come, brother, show me what you've learned." Denny launched himself forward, spear gleaming like the first light of dawn, determined to end the trickster's twisted game. Denny's feet barely touched the icy floor as he closed the distance between himself and Loki. Time seemed to slow, the echoes of battle fading to a dull roar as adrenaline coursed through his veins. Gungnir thrummed in his hands, its runes blazing with golden light, and Denny felt every heartbeat like the drum of a war march. Loki watched him approach, a wicked gleam in his eyes. And just as Denny lunged, Loki's form dissolved again, slipping away like smoke caught in a sudden breeze. Denny stumbled and rolled, recovering just in time to see Loki reappear across the hall. The god's silhouette shimmered with ethereal energy, as if the fabric of reality resisted his presence. His voice dripped mockery as he said, "You'll have to do better than that, Denny." Eric fought nearby, hacking through the ice beasts with sweat plastering his hair to his face. Each swing of his sword shattered a monster, but each victory was fleeting as more emerged from the enchanted ice columns. Selene was at his side, her hands a blur of motion as she unleashed wave after wave of elemental fire. The beasts fell back only momentarily, their bodies steaming as they reformed with terrifying speed. "Denny, we can't keep this up," Selene called, her voice edged with exhaustion. Loki waved a hand, and the temperature of the room plummeted further. Frost crept along the edges of Denny's vision, blurring the outlines of his friends. He could feel the cold worming its way into his bones, sapping his strength. Loki's laughter rang out, filling the hall with an eerie, hollow sound. "This is where you break," Loki said, stepping forward. His eyes, twin pools of emerald fire, narrowed as he raised his hand. Shadows spun from his fingertips, weaving into a twisting spear of darkness. Denny's fingers tightened around Gungnir, and he forced himself upright, his breath visible in the freezing air. He met Loki's gaze, defiance blazing in his eyes. "I'm not afraid of you." Loki's expression darkened. "You should be." He thrust the shadow spear forward, and it surged through the air with a speed that made the world blur. Denny barely blocked it, swinging Gungnir in a wide arc that sent the spear crashing into an ice pillar. The impact split the column, and the entire hall shuddered as cracks snaked across the floor and up the walls. Eric fell back, the ice creatures pausing their assault as the room quaked. Selene's flames sputtered, and she reached for support, eyes wide with alarm. "Enough games," Denny shouted, channeling every ounce of power he could summon into Gungnir. The spear's runes flared blindingly bright, and a pulse of pure energy rippled through the hall, shattering the nearest ice creatures and disrupting Loki's conjured shadows. Loki hissed, his composure slipping as he staggered. His eyes met Denny's, and there was a moment, a brief, vulnerable flicker, that spoke of more than just rage. It was a challenge, a silent dare. Denny surged forward, his steps echoing as he crossed the hall and brought Gungnir up in a comprehensive, arcing slash aimed directly at Loki's chest. This time, Loki did not teleport away. He raised a hand, catching the spear's tip with a force reverberating through Denny's body. Their faces were inches apart, both straining, eyes locked in a deadly stalemate. "Why?" Denny ground out, his breath frosting between them. "Why all of this?" Loki's smile was colder than the ice around them. "To show you the truth, that you, even with all your valor, are nothing against the tide of gods and monsters." With a burst of strength, Loki twisted Gungnir away, sending Denny stumbling backward. But before Loki could press his advantage, Eric appeared at Denny's side, sword gleaming with defiant light. Selene stood behind them, power radiating from her hands as she prepared another spell. "This ends now," she said, determination hardening her voice. Loki's eyes flickered between them, measuring, calculating. His smile wavered, and for the first time, a shadow of doubt crossed his face. The walls continued to crack, the chamber shaking as if the realm could sense the conflict's peak. "We are not afraid," Denny said, stepping forward with his friends at his back. Gungnir gleamed, ready to strike. Loki's smirk faltered as the trio moved in unison. The sound of their combined advance broke the hall's frozen silence, and the trickster god took a step back for the first time. The clash of power, steel, and shadow climaxed as Denny, Eric, and Selene pressed their attack against Loki. The trickster's smirk twisted into a snarl as he blocked and countered with fierce strikes, the hall resonating with the sounds of their battle. With one last surge, Denny pushed Loki back, thrusting Gungnir with a force that crackled through the air. Loki stumbled, eyes narrowing, as he realized the tide had shifted against him. The cracks in the floor glowed with an angry light, and a low, ominous rumble echoed beneath their feet. "Denny," Selene called, her voice laced with warning. The enchantments holding the hall together were unraveling, and the icy constructs began to fracture, collapsing into piles of crystalline shards. Loki's gaze darted from Denny to the collapsing hall, and his lips curled into a tight smile. Well played, half-brother, but this is far from over. With a final, cold stare, his body shimmered and dissolved into shadow, leaving only the sound of his laughter in their ears. The trio barely had a moment to catch their breath before the hall's columns began to shatter, raining shards of ice. Eric grabbed Denny by the arm. "We need to get out of here. Now!" Celine's magic flared, creating a shield that deflected falling debris as they sprinted toward the exit. The room quaked with the fury of a collapsing glacier, but together they pushed through, emerging into the cold, starlit expanse outside just as the chamber behind them imploded in a thunderous crash. Panting, Denny leaned on Gungnir, his body aching from the fight. Eric and Celine stood beside him, their faces pale but alive with relief and exhaustion. "It's over," Eric said, his voice husky. But Denny knew better. He looked out over the dark expanse of Niflheim, its ice plains stretching endlessly under the northern lights. The air was sharp and quiet, but hummed with something dark and unfinished. "No," Denny murmured, eyes fixed on the horizon where the stars seemed dimmer than before. "This was just a warning." Celine nodded, her expression sad. "Loki's playing a long game. We need to be ready." Eric sheathed his sword and took a deep breath, the weight of their victory tempered by the shadows of what was to come. "Then we prepare," he said, a note of steel in his voice. "Whatever he's planning, we'll be ready." Denny stood taller, the warmth of Gungnir's magic a steady pulse in his hand. Odin's will, and now his own, carried a renewed purpose. The battle in Niflheim had tested them and forged them into something more. As they began the long journey back to Asgard, the northern lights swirled overhead, casting their glow like a watchful eye. The cold wind whispered of future trials, and somewhere in the shadows, Loki's laughter lingered, a chilling reminder that the actual storm was yet to come. That's going to do it for this tale. This tale continues with the next adventure on Tales from the Shadows, so be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Until next time, stay tuned, stay weird, and watch out for what lurks in the shadows.
This has been Tales from the Shadows, where the shadows speak the stories that will make you weak. Join us on this journey into the unknown. Tales from the Shadows, where fear is shown. So subscribe and like, and don't be afraid to dive into the darkness where the shadows are laid.